Alarm cut through the quiet bridge of the Starlight Hope like a knife through silk. Captain Laura looked up from her coffee and turned toward the center station, where Danny was already pulling up the data. The young pilot had sharp eyes and quick hands, and right now both were moving faster than usual. What do we have? Laura asked as she walked across the bridge. "The beacon, Captain," Dan said. "It is weak, but it is definitely there, coming from the Hollow Reach sector." Felt her stomach tighten. The Hollow Reach was a frozen stretch of space filled with unstable asteroids and abandoned mining operation. Ships that went into the Hollow Reach did not always come back out. She leaned over Dane's shoulder and studied the signal pattern on his screen. "Can you identify the source?" And worked his controls for a moment. "Registry, the ship is called the Whisper Dawn, cargo freighter, crew of 12. She was reported missing 3 weeks ago." Weeks. Laura closed her eyes and let out a slow breath. 3 weeks was a long time for any ship to be stranded, but for a vessel it was almost certainly a death sentence. There were reptilian species who needed warmth the way humans needed air. They had average temperatures of 45 degrees, and their bodies simply shut down in the cold. If the Whisper Dawn had been drifting in the Hollow Reach for 3 weeks with damaged systems, her crew was almost certainly dead. But almost certainly was not the same as definitely. "And of course," Laura said. He looked up at her with surprise in his eyes. "Captain, the Hollow Reach is extremely dangerous. The asteroid density alone makes navigation nearly impossible, and if we take damage out there, no one will come for us either." "I know the risks," Laura said calmly. "Set the course." Hesitated for only a second before nodding and turning back to his controls. He was a good pilot and an even better crew member. He would follow her into hell if she asked him to, and she loved him for that loyalty even when she wished he would argue with her more. Walked to the metal bay and found Dr. Shaw organizing his supply cabinet. Was a tall man with gentle hands and kind eyes, and he had served with Laura for almost 6 years now. He looked up when she entered and immediately read the expression on her face. "We have a job," he said. It was not a question. They were stranded in the Hollow Reach, 3 weeks missing. Set down the supplies he was holding and leaned against his examination table. 3 weeks in cold space. Laura, you know what that means for. "I know what it probably means," Laura said, "but probably is not good enough for me to turn away." Her face for a long moment. They had known each other long enough that words were not always necessary between them. He could see the determination in her jaw and the fire in her eyes, and he knew that nothing he said would change her mind. So instead of arguing, he simply nodded and began preparing his emergency medical kit. "Me about cold response," Laura said as she watched him work. "Their body temperature dropped below a certain point. They enter a hibernation state," explained. "Their heart rate slows to almost nothing, their breathing becomes so shallow it is nearly undetectable, and their scales lose their color. It is a survival mechanism, but it only buys them a few hours at most. After that, their organs begin to fail." "Few hours," Laura repeated, "not 3 weeks." "3 weeks," agreed. "But there are factors that could extend survival. Youth, physical fitness, access to even mineral heat sources. It is unlikely, but not impossible." Nodded slowly. Unlikely, but not impossible. Those were words she could work with. She had built her entire career on unlikely, but not impossible. The rescue service did not attract people who gave up easily, and Laura had never given up on anything in her life. Turned to the bridge as Danny finished plying their course. The navigation display showed a winding path through the asteroid field, marked with dozens of warning indicators. It would take them 14 hours to reach the last known position of the Whisper Dawn, and every minute of that journey would be dangerous. "Course is set," Dan said. "We can launch whenever you are ready." Took her seat in the captain's chair and looked out at the stars ahead. Somewhere out there, 12 were waiting, probably dead, almost certainly dead, but she would not know for sure until she saw them with her own eyes, and until that moment she would keep hopping. "I goes in," he said. Light Hope turned toward the darkness of the Hollow Reach and began her journey. The first few hours passed without incident, but as they moved deeper into the asteroid field, the tension on the bridge grew thick. Danny's hands never left his controls, constantly making small adjustments to avoid the tumbling rocks that surrounded them. Laura watched the center display and called out warnings whenever she spotted something he might have missed. Worked together like a single organism, anticipating each other's movements and communicating with glances and gestures. This was what made them good at their job. This was why they had saved more lives than any other rescue crew in their sector. They trusted each other completely, and that trust made them stronger than any individual could ever be. Hours into the journey, they finally spotted the Whisper Dawn on their cinders. The freighter was drifting slowly near a large asteroid, her running lights dark and her engines cold. Ice crystals covered her hull like a funeral shroud, sparkling faintly in the distant starlight. "Power readings," Dan said quietly. "No heat signatures, she is completely dead." Stared at the frozen ship and felt something heavy settle in her chest. She had known that was likely. She had prepared herself for this outcome. But knowing and seeing were different things, and seeing the Whisper Dawn like this hurt more than she had expected. "Cause closer," she said. "We are going aboard." But on the bridge with his medical kit slung over his shoulder, he looked at the sensor display and then at Laura, and she could see the same sadness in his eyes that she felt in her heart, but neither of them spoke about it. There would be time for grief later. Right now, they had a job to do. Starlight Hope moved slowly toward the frozen freighter, and Laura began preparing herself for what she would find inside. 12 bodies. 12 who had died alone in the cold, far from home and far from anyone who could help them. She would document their deaths and notify their families, and add their names to the long list of people she had been too late to save. As they drew closer, something on the scanner made him freeze. He stared at the display, adjusted his settings, and stared again. When he looked up at Laura, his eyes were wide with something she had not seen there in a very long time. "Oh, yeah. Laura," he said softly, "I'm picking up a heartbeat." Was moving before finished speaking. She grabbed her environmental suit from the storage locker and began pulling it on with practiced speed. Her fingers worked the seals and clasps automatically while her mind raced through possibilities. One heartbeat, one survivor out of 12. It was more than she had dared to hope for, and she was not going to waste a single second. "Strong as the signal?" she asked as she sealed her helmet. Took his head slowly, barely there, made 40 beats per minute, and that is dangerously low even for hibernating. Whoever is alive in there is fatting fast. "And we move fast," Laura said. Brought the Starlight Hope alongside the freighter and extended the docking tube. The connection was rough because the Whisper Dawn was not responding to any automated system, but Danny was skilled enough to make it work manually. Within minutes, they had a sealed passage between the ships. Stepped into the docking tube first with Chloe behind her. The cold hit them immediately, even through their heat suits. The temperature reading on Laura's display showed negative 30 degrees inside the ship. For humans, that was uncomfortable, for it was lethal. Through the main airlock and found themselves in a corridor that had once been warm and bright. Now it was dark and covered in frost. Ice crystals hung from the ceiling like frozen tears, and the walls were coated in a thin layer of white. Laura activated her helmet light and swept the beam across the corridor, revealing the first of the bodies. He lay against the wall, his scales and lifeless, his eyes closed as if in sleep. He was dressed in the uniform of a cargo handler, and his hands were pressed against his chest as if trying to hold in whatever warmth remained. Laura knelt beside him and placed her gloved hand on his shoulder. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm sorry we did not get here sooner." The Bayan shook his head. There was no heartbeat, no brain activity, nothing to indicate that life remained. This had been dead for at least 2 weeks. Laura stood and continued down the corridor and followed in silence. Found 3 more bodies in the crew quarters, 2 females and another male, all frozen in positions of desperate survival. One had wrapped herself in every blanket she could find. Another had curled into a tight ball in the corner of her bunk. The third had died trying to reach the door, his hand stretched out toward the handle as if help had been just beyond his reach. Documented each body with her suit's camera and said a quiet word over each one. She did not know their names or their stories, but she knew that they had been people. They had families and friends and dreams and fears. They had lived and laughed and loved, and now they were gone. The universe was a little dark for their loss. "Heartbeat is coming from the cargo hold," said checking his scanner. "Lower deck near the stern." Moved faster now, climbing down ladders and pushing through frozen doors. The ship groaned around them as they moved, her hull protesting against the cold that had claimed her. Laura tried not to think about what would happen if the structural integrity failed while they were aboard. She had to focus on the life ahead, not the death around her. The hold was the large space on the ship, filled with crates and containers that had once held valuable goods. The raiders who attacked the Whispered Dawn had taken most of the cargo, leaving behind only empty boxes and scattered debris. But in the far corner of the hold, near a small emergency heating unit, Laura saw something that made her heart leap. Female was curled around the heating unit, her body wrapped so tightly around the small device that she almost seemed to be embracing it. Her scales were like the others, but there was the faintest hint of green still visible beneath the frost. She was small, probably young by standards, and she had clearly fought harder than anyone else on this ship to stay alive. Ran across the hold and dropped to her knees beside the young. The heating unit was barely functioning, giving off a tiny amount of warmth that would have been useless for anyone else. But the girl had clung to it like a lifeline, and somehow the tiny warmth had kept her heart beating when everyone else had failed. "It's alive," confirmed as he knelt on the other side. "But barely. Her core temperature is critical and her organs are beginning to shut down. We need to get her to the ship immediately." Reach out and touch the young's face. Her skin was cold, colder than anything Laura had ever felt, and it was rough with frost. But beneath that cold surface, Laura could feel the faintest pull of life. This girl was still fighting. After 3 weeks in the cold, after watching her die one by one, she was still fighting. Eyes fluttered open. They were dim and unfocused, but they found Laura's face and stayed there. Laura could see the fear in those eyes, the confusion and the pain. This young woman did not know who Laura was or why she was here. She only knew that she was dying and that something strange was happening around her. Removed her heated glove. The cold immediately bit into her fingers, but she did not care. She placed her bare hand against this frozen cheek and let her warmth flow into that dying flesh. It was a small gesture, almost meaningless in the face of such desperate circumstances, but sometimes small gestures were all you had. "We're safe now," Laura murmured softly. "I have got you. You are going to be okay." His eyes widened slightly, as if the words had reached some part of her that was still awake and aware. Her cracked lips moved, trying to form words, but no sound came out. Instead, she simply stared at Laura with something that looked almost like wonder. He was already preparing a thermal blanket from his kit. He wrapped it around the young as gently as possible, being careful not to move her too quickly. Warming a frozen body too fast could be just as deadly as the cold itself. They would need to raise her temperature slowly and carefully, or they would kill her in the process of trying to save her. "We need to carry her," Laura said. "Can we move her safely?" "Do not have a choice," replied. "She will not survive another hour in here." Nodding, carefully slid her arm beneath his body. She was lighter than Laura expected, her frame thin and fragile from weeks of starvation and cold. Laura lifted her slowly, cradling her against her chest like a child, and began walking toward the exit. Journey back through the frozen ship was the longest walk of Laura's life. Every step felt like it took an hour. Every breath felt like it might be the last one that would ever take. But Laura kept moving, kept putting one foot in front of the other, kept holding on to the precious cargo in her arms. Reached the docking tube, and Danny was waiting for them on the other side. His eyes went wide when he saw them in Laura's arms, but he did not ask questions. He simply stepped aside and let them pass, then sealed the airlock behind them. Warmth of the starlight hope wrapped around them like a blessing. Laura carried the young to the medical bay and laid her gently on the examination table. Was already activating the warning systems, setting up monitors, preparing medications that might help stabilize her condition. Stood beside the table and looked down at the young woman they had saved. She was still and still cold, but she was still breathing. That was all that mattered right now. She was still breathing, and as long as she was breathing, there was hope. "What is her name?" Danny asked from the doorway. Laura shook her head. "I do not know, but we are going to find out." 48 hours were the hardest of Laura's career. She had pulled survivors from burning ships and collapsing stations, from asteroid impacts and pirate attacks, but she had never faced anything quite like this. The young hovered between life and death, her body fighting against itself as it tried desperately to bring her back. Problem was temperature. Needed warmth to survive, but warring a frozen body too quick caused the blood vessels to expand faster than the heart could handle. Had to raise her core temperature by fractions of a degree at a time, monitoring her heart rate and blood pressure constantly. One mistake could kill her instantly. Refused to leave the metal bay. She sat beside the examination table hour after hour, watching the monitors and holding the young's hand. The girl's scales were slowly regaining their color, shifting from the pale green that gave Laura hope, but her eyes remained closed and her breathing remained shallow and his face remained worried. "I've contacted the nearest metal station," said during the first night. "They are 6 days away, and they say there is nothing they can do that we are not already doing. They also said that recovery from the level of hypothermia is extremely rare." Looked at him with hard eyes. "Rare is not impossible." "No," agreed softly. "Rare is not impossible." The second day, Dan came up with an idea. The Starlight Hope had heat exchangers connected to her main engine, and those exchangers could produce a steady, gentle warmth that was perfect for gradual heating. He spent 6 hours converting one of the cargo bays into a recovery chamber, lining the walls with thermal panels and installing metal monitors throughout the space. When he finished, they moved the young into the new chamber. The temperature inside was set to 25 degrees, warm enough to help her heal but cool enough to prevent shock. added humidity to the air because it came from a planet with thick, wet atmospheres and dry air could damage their lungs. Continued her vigil in the new location. She brought a chair and a blanket and a stack of old books she had been meaning to read. But she never opened the books. She just sat and watched and waited, talking softly to the unconscious girl whenever the silence became too heavy. "Do not know if you can hear me," Laura said during the second night, "but I want you to know that you are not alone anymore. We are here and we are going to take care of you. You just have to keep fighting. Can you do that for me? Can you keep fighting?" Did not respond, but her heart rate increased slightly just for a moment, and Laura chose to believe that meant something. The third day, the young opened her eyes. Was dozing in her chair when she heard a soft sound from the metal bed. She sat up immediately and found herself looking into a pair of golden eyes that were finally clear and focused. The young was staring at her with an expression that mixed fear and confusion, and something else that Laura could not quite identify. "Oh," Laura said gently. "My name is Laura. You are safe. You are on my ship." Tried to speak, but her voice came out as a rough croak. Laura quickly grabbed a cup of warm water from the side table and helped her drink. The liquid seemed to revive her somewhat, and when she tried to speak again, words actually came out. As she whispered, "Where am I?" "Are on the human rescue vessel Starlight Hope," Laura explained. "We found your ship drifting in the Hollow Reach. We brought you here and we have been taking care of you." His eyes widened as memories began flooding back. Laura could see the moment when she remembered what had happened, the moment when the weight of her situation crashed down on her. Tears began forming in those golden eyes, and her body started to shake. "Crew," she whispered, "my brother, are they alive?" Laura's heart broke. She had been dreading the moment since they first found the young woman on that frozen ship. She reached out and took this hand in both of hers, holding it gently but firmly. "I'm so sorry," Laura said. "You were the only survivor. The others did not make it." Closed her eyes and let out a sound that was not quite a scream and not quite a sob. It was something deeper than either, a sound of grief so profound that it seemed to come from her very soul. Laura held her hand and let her cry, not trying to offer words of comfort that would have felt hollow and meaningless. Several minutes, the tears slowed and the shaking stopped. The young opened her eyes again and looked at Laura with an expression of utter exhaustion. "My name is," she said quietly. "Thank you for saving me." "Saved yourself?" Laura replied. "You held on when anyone else would have given up. We just helped you finish the journey." Took her head slowly. "I wanted to give up. Every day I wanted to give up, but something kept me going. Some voice in my head kept telling me to hold on for just one more hour." Laura smiled softly. That voice was right. The next few days grew stronger, kept her in the warring chamber but gradually increased her activity level, letting her sit up and eventually stand and walk. She was weak and thin and haunted by nightmares, but she was alive. That was more than anyone had expected. Spent most of her free time with, talking to her and listening to her stories. She learned about the Whispered Dawn and her crew, about the routine cargo run that had turned into a nightmare. Raiders had attacked them without warning, overwhelming their defenses and stealing their cargo. Then they had sailed the engines and left them to drift, knowing that the cold would finish what they had started. "Wanted no witnesses," said bitterly. "Dead ships tell no tales." "But you survived," Laura pointed out. "You are wits now." Looked at her with something like surprise in her eyes. "Yes, I suppose I am." One of their conversations asked a question that Laura had been expecting since the beginning. "Did you come for us?" asked. "The Hollow Reach is dangerous. Your people could have died trying to reach us. Why take that risk for stranger?" Thought about the question for a long moment before answering. "On Earth, where I come from, we have a saying. No one gets left behind. It means that we do not abandon people who need help, no matter who they are or where they come from. When we heard your distress signal, we came. That is what we do." Looked at her with those golden eyes, clearly struggling to understand. "But we are nothing to you. Our governments barely speak to each other. Why would you risk your lives for people who mean nothing to your world?" Smiled and squeezed his hand. "Because meaning something to government and meaning something as a person are two different things. You are a person. That is all that matters." Silent for a long time after that. When she finally spoke again, her voice was thick with emotion. "I do not understand humans," she admitted, "but I think I would like to." Starlight Hope set course for space on the fifth day after the rescue. Was strong enough to walk around the ship now, though she tired easily and still needed to spend most of her time in the warring chamber. Monitored her constantly, adjusting her treatment as her body slowly remembered how to function normally. Found herself growing closer to with each passing day. The young was curious and intelligent, asking endless questions about humans and their customs. She was fascinated by everything from the food they ate to the music they listened to, and Laura enjoyed teaching her about the world she came from. "Do you drink your water cold?" asked one afternoon as she watched Laura pour herself a glass. "Cold things are unpleasant." Laughed. "Not to humans. We actually find cold water refreshing, especially when we are hot." Visibly, "I cannot imagine wanting to be cold ever again." Satan turned serious when started talking about what happened on the Whispered Dawn. Laura had heard bits and pieces before, but now told her the whole story from beginning to end. Her voice was steady, but Laura could see the pain behind her golden eyes. "Raiders came on the fourth day of our journey," said. "We were carrying medical supplies to a colony on the outer rim. Nothing valuable enough to risk piracy, or so we thought. But they wanted the supplies, and they wanted them badly enough to kill for them." "Supplies?" Laura repeated with a frown. "That seems like an unusual target for raiders." "We thought so too, but they did not explain themselves. They just took what they wanted and left us to die." Paused and looked out the window at the stars passing by. Her scales rippled slightly, an expression of deep emotion that Laura had learned to recognize. "Her brother's name was," continued quietly. "He was the chief engineer on the Whispered Dawn. When the raiders disabled our engines, he worked for 3 days straight trying to repair them. He would not give up. He kept saying that help would come, that someone would find us." "He sounds like a good man," Laura said. "He was the best man I ever knew," replied. "He died on the 9th day. I held his hand as his heart stopped. Promised him I would survive, that I would tell people what happened here. I think that promise is the only reason I am still alive." Reached out and took his hand. The young skin was warmer now, almost approaching normal temperature, and her scales had returned to their natural deep green color. She looked healthy, at least on the outside, but Laura knew that the wounds inside would take much longer to heal. "Kept your promise," Laura said. "You survived and you will tell people what happened. The raiders will not get away with this." Looked at her with an expression that was hard to read. "Do you really believe that? In my experience, raiders always get away with their crimes. The galaxy is too big and justice is too slow." "Believe that justice finds a way," Laura replied. "Maybe not always and maybe not quickly, but eventually. And even if it does not, you survived. You are living proof that they failed. That matters." Next day, they received a message from the government. Laura read it with growing frustration, her jaw tightening with every word. When she finished, she handed the tablet to Danny and watched him read it with the same expression. Thanking us for the rescue, Danny said flatly. But they are also informing us that rescue missions into unstable regions are not expected or required, and that future attempts should not be made without official authorization. In other words, they are telling us not to come next time, Laura said bitterly. His head from his seat at the medical station. That is incredibly cold, even for bureaucrats. 12 of their people died out there, and their only response is to warn us not to help again. Thought about whether to show the message to. Part of her wanted to protect the young woman from further pain, but another part of her felt that deserved to know the truth. In the end, she decided that honesty was more important than comfort. The message without expression. When she finished, she handed the tablet back to Laura and sat in silence for a long moment. Does not surprise me, she said finally. My government values efficiency above all else. They see your rescue mission as a risk that was not worth taking, regardless of the outcome. They would have made the same calculation and decided to let us die. That is horrible, Deng said. The human gesture she had picked up during her time on the ship. It is practical. Are taught from birth that resources are limited and must be used wisely. Spending resources on a rescue that has little chance of success is considered wasteful. You were successful, Laura pointed out. You are alive because we came. Survivor out of 12, replied. From their perspective, that is not a good return on investment. Felt anger rising in her chest, hot and sharp. She had spent her entire career saving lives, and she could not understand a culture that would calculate the value of those lives like numbers on a balance sheet. Every life mattered, every single one. That was not just a belief to her. It was a truth as fundamental as gravity. What do you think? Laura asked. Do you agree with your government? Quiet for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was thoughtful and slow. To agree with them, she admitted. Before this happened, I would have said the same thing they are saying now. Resources are limited. Risk must be calculated. Efficiency matters more than sentiment. She paused and looked at Laura with those golden eyes. But then I was dying in the cold and you came for me anyway. You risked your lives for someone you had never met, someone who meant nothing to your world or your government. And I cannot reconcile that with everything I was taught to believe. I smiled subtly. Maybe that means everything you were taught was wrong. Maybe, agreed. Or maybe it means there is more than one way to be right. Late into the night about philosophy and cult, and the different ways that species approach the concept of value, Laura learned that society had developed in an environment of scarcity, where resources were always limited and difficult choices had to be made. Humans had faced similar challenges in their history, but they had evolved differently, developing a sense of collective responsibility that extended beyond simple calculation. Waste resources on hopeless causes all the time, Laura admitted. Sometimes we fail. Sometimes people die despite our best efforts, but we keep trying because giving up feels worse than failing. Considered that for a moment, that seems inefficient. Laughed. It absolutely is, but it is also who we are, and I would not change it for anything. Going to sleep that night, stopped at the door of the warring chamber and looked back at Laura. You, she said softly, not just for saving my life, but for showing me that there are other ways to live. I have much to think about. Nodded and smiled. Take all the time you need. We have a few more days before we reach your space. Peered into the chamber and Laura was left alone with her thoughts. She wondered what would happen when they finally delivered to her people. Would the young return to her old way of thinking, or had something fundamental changed inside her? Only time would tell. Laura had hope. Hope was what she did best. An amber reach appeared on the sensors on the 12th day of their journey. It was a massive structure, all smooth curves and gold metal, orbiting a red dwarf star that bathed everything in warm light. Laura had to admit it was beautiful in its own alien way, though she preferred the sharper lines of human architecture. On the bridge beside her, watching her station grow larger her expression was unreadable, but Laura could sense the tension in her body. This was the moment had been both dreading and anticipating since the rescue. She was coming home, but home would never feel the same again. Are you ready? Laura asked gently. A deep breath and nod. I do not think I will ever be truly ready, but I cannot run from this forever. The docking procedure was smooth and efficient, handled entirely by the station's automated system. Within minutes, the Starlight Hope was locked into place and the airlock was cycling open. Laura could feel the warmth from the station flooding into the ship, and she saw scales bright slightly in response. A legation of officials was waiting for them in the docking bay. They were dressed in formal robes of deep purple and gold, and their expressions were as cold as the space had nearly died in. Laura felt an immediate dislike for them, though he tried to keep her face neutral. The leader of the delegation stepped forward and spoke in clipped, formal tones. Survivor, you are required to provide a complete account of the incident involving the cargo vessel Whisper Dawn. Your testimony will be recorded and analyzed for administrative purposes. While home, no expression of relief that she had survived, no acknowledgement of what she had been through, just bureaucratic efficiency exactly as had described. Tightened, but she nodded and began to step forward. Before she could move, Laura placed a hand on her shoulder. Has been through a tremendous ordeal, Laura said firmly. She needs rest and medical attention, not an interrogation. The delegation leader looked at Laura as if noticing her for the first time. His golden eyes were dismissive and cold. Human, your assistance is acknowledged and will be noted in our records. However, this is now a matter. Your involvement is no longer required. I felt her temorizing, but before she could respond, spoke. It is my life sister, said clearly. Under tradition, she has the right to be present for any official proceedings involving me. The delegation leader blinked in surprise. Life sister, that is a family bond. You cannot claim such a connection with an outsider. And I do, replied. Her voice was steady and strong, stronger than Laura had ever heard it. She pulled me from the edge of death with her own hands. She stayed by my side for days without rest, keeping me alive when all hope was lost. If that does not qualify her as my life sister, then the tradition has no meaning. Officials exchanged uncomfortable glances. Laura did not fully understand what was happening, but she could see that it put them in a difficult position. Whatever this life sister tradition meant, it apparently carried significant weight in culture. Well, the delegation leader said stiffly, the human may come on you, but this irregularity will be noted. Whatever you wish, said calmly. Briefing that followed was long and tedious, but Laura stayed by side through every moment of it. She listened as recounted the attack on the Whisper Dawn, the days of desperate survival, the slow deaths of her, and finally her own near death before the human rescue. The officials recorded everything without emotion, asking occasional questions that focused entirely on facts and timeline. It was finally over, was allowed to return to the docking bay with Laura. They stood together in front of the Starlight Hope, knowing that this was the moment of goodbye. Laura felt an unexpected tightness in her chest. Something for you, said. She reached into her robe and pulled out a small object that glittered in the warm light of the station. It was a crystal pendant on a thin chain, carved with intricate patterns that seemed to shift and move as Laura looked at them. This is a bonding token, explained. Among my people, it is given only to family members. It represents a connection that transcends blood, a bond that can never be broken. She pressed the pendant into Laura's hands. I want you to have it. Laura looked at the beautiful object and felt tears forming in her eyes. I cannot accept this. It is too valuable. It's exactly valuable enough, replied. You gave me my life. This is the only thing I have that comes close to matching that gift. Closed her fingers around the pendant and pulled into a hug. The young stiffened at first, clearly unused to such physical contact, but then she relaxed and returned the embrace. They stood that way for a long moment, two people from different worlds connected by an experience that neither would ever forget. We'll come back, Laura promised. Whenever my roots bring me near space, I will visit you. I will be waiting, said. Separated, and Laura walked back toward her ship. She was almost at the airlock when called out to her one last time. Laura, she said, when I was dying in the cold, I thought I was alone. I thought no one would ever come for me, that I would fade away without anyone knowing or caring. She paused, and her voice grew thick with emotion. Then I heard your voice telling me I was safe. I will never forget that moment for as long as I live. Laura smiled through her tears. Neither will I. Starlight Hope departed from Amber Reach an hour later. Laura stood on the bridge and watched the stage shrink on the end until it was just a tiny speck of light among the stars. Beside her, Danny and were quiet, respecting her need for silence. She reached up and touched the crystal pendant hanging around her neck. It was warm against her skin, warmer than any earth stone, and she could feel a gentle pulse of energy within it. It told her that the crystal would always be connected to its twin, which now wore. No matter how far apart they were, the pendants would always be linked. A month later, Laura received a message from space. It was short and simple, but it made her smile wider than she had smiled in years. The message was from. She had volunteered to join a newly formed emergency response unit, the first of its kind in their history. The unit had been created after news of her rescue spread through the galactic community, and people began asking why it did not have such services. The answer had embarrassed enough officials that they decided to change things. It was small and underfunded, but it was a start. Had been named one of its first coordinators, and she was already working on training programs based on human rescue protocols. Her message ended with 5 words that meant more to Laura than any medal or commendation she had ever received. No one gets left behind. Printed those words and hung them on the wall of her bridge, right where she could see them every day. They were a reminder of why she did this job, why she flew into danger for strangers she had never met. They were a reminder that one act of compassion could change not just one life, but an entire culture. Somewhere out there, on a warm station orbiting a red dwarf star, a young woman was telling others about the humans who flew into the cold because they believed every life mattered. She was passing on a message that had traveled from Earth to the farthest reaches of space, a simple truth that transcended species and color, and all the barriers that separated living beings from one another. Life matters. No one gets left behind. And sometimes the warmest thing in the universe is not a star or a flare, but a hand reaching out in the dark to tell you that you are not alone.